On the 15th morning, the first thing I noticed was the flag. It hung from the short pole near the westbound parking loop. Not straight out, not limp either, just moving in a small, undecided way. There was a light wind coming in from the flats, enough to lift dust from the edge of the frontage road and slide it in thin, pale ribbons across the asphalt. The sun had only just cleared the low ridge behind the maintenance shed. The vending machines were still humming inside the concrete breezeway. The rooftop evaporative units had started their low mechanical breathing. Somewhere behind the dumpster enclosure, a raven knocked something hollow against metal. Everything I could see suggested an ordinary morning. What was missing was the road. Interstate traffic has a sound floor. People who do not spend much time near highways think of traffic as individual noises. An engine climbing, brakes, a motorcycle crossing a bridge joint. But if you work around roads long enough, what you really hear is the continuous body of it, a moving pressure. Tire hiss layered over freight diesel and crosswind, and occasional turbulence in the sound wall gaps. Even at 3 in the morning there is usually something. A truck in the distance, a late sedan, a refrigerated trailer with the unit rattling half a mile before the headlights reach you. That morning there was none of it. I stood outside the service door with my coffee in a paper cup and listened to nothing move in either direction. It was so unusual that my first thought was not danger. My first thought was that I had somehow gone briefly deaf in a very selective way. I could hear the raven. I could hear the plastic lid clicking against the rim of my coffee. I could hear one of the light poles buzzing faintly as the timer switched the lot lights off. But I could not hear a single vehicle on 4 lanes of interstate that usually carried more than 20,000 a day, even through the thinner shoulder seasons. I set the cup on the concrete bollard and walked out to the overlook at the edge of the parking area. The westbound lanes were empty. The eastbound lanes were empty. The far heat shimmer had not started yet, so I could see a long way. No trucks, no campers, no headlights fading into dawn, no state patrol, no cattle hauler, no rental box van with somebody's life tied down under blue tarp and nylon rope. Even the access ramp was clear. For a full minute I just stood there and listened to the absence. By then I had already spent 14 nights alone at Coyote Wells Rest Area, which sounds more dramatic than it felt at the time. The truth is that solitude becomes ordinary very quickly when it comes with a schedule, a checklist, and a place that needs you to keep it running. The place was not abandoned, not yet. It was mine in the temporary, practical sense that a worksite becomes yours when you are the only one there long enough to know its sounds. My name is Daniel Soto. At the time, I worked for a contractor that handled water systems, accessibility fixes, and general facilities upkeep for state-operated rest areas across southern Arizona and western New Mexico. It was a narrower job than people imagine. I was not building highways, and I was not a full civil engineer, though that is how I sometimes explained it to relatives, because it sounded cleaner than saying I spent half my life checking chlorination logs, repairing touchless faucets, measuring slope compliance on picnic pads, and arguing about signage fonts with people who had never once emptied a sand-clogged drain. What I actually did was keep pauses functional. That was how I thought about rest areas, not destinations, not buildings. Pauses. Engine cooling, dog walking, map folding, diaper changing, sun-escaping pauses built into the long arithmetic of American distance. A working sink, a shaded bench, a place to stand without being in the lane of movement. If a rest stop did its job well, most people barely remembered it. Coyote Wells was a newer facility on an older site, set about 80 miles west of Gila Bend in a stretch of country where the land looked at first empty, and then, if you stayed long enough, densely occupied by heat, small birds, spined plants, wind-carved drainage channels, and an almost administrative amount of light. The state had shut the place for a water system overhaul after repeated failures in the old holding tank. My company had been brought in for the recommissioning phase, testing the new cistern, calibrating the chlorination feed, reopening one building at a time, checking that the accessibility updates had been installed to spec, and generally making sure that when the barriers came down, the public side of the place felt ordinary. Coyote Wells had 2 restroom buildings facing each other across a breezeway lined with vending machines and tourist brochure racks. Beyond that sat a picnic grove with steel ramadas, a pet walk, and a broad truck and RV lot that always seemed slightly too large for the number of vehicles using it. The public side was open to the desert on 3 sides. The service side sat behind a chain-link gate and held the maintenance shed, the generator enclosure, a chemical storage cage, a compact workshop, and a narrow staff room that was part office, part bunk space, part place to eat reheated food in fluorescent peace. Because the site was so far from town, and because we were in a stretch of work where daily presence mattered more than commuting, I stayed there during the final 2-week run. I had a camp cot in the staff room, a small electric kettle, a cooler, 2 duffel bags, a stack of inspection binders, and the kind of temporary domestic order men create when they know they are not living somewhere but still need to feel arranged. Toothbrush in a paper cup by the utility sink. Work shirts hung from the cabinet latch. Phone on charge beside the nightly log sheets. Peanut butter, instant oatmeal, canned chili, coffee, aspirin, spare socks. If you have never slept at a closed desert rest area, it is difficult to explain how quickly its rhythms start to feel personal. Daylight made the concrete bright and impersonal. By noon, every handrail was hot. The breeze smelled of dust, creosote, and occasionally diesel if traffic was dense. But at night, the place contracted. The lot lights cast separate islands rather than one field of illumination. Bugs stitched themselves around the bulbs. The vending machines became the brightest objects for 30 yards in any direction. Trucks slowed on the highway, and their tires made that broad, oceanic hush that I usually heard in my sleep. For the first few nights, I liked being there more than I expected. I was 42 then, recently divorced in the civilized, paperwork-heavy way that leaves everybody tired rather than shattered. My son Mateo was in his first year at community college in Tucson, living partly with his mother, and partly, as far as I could tell, inside his headphones. I had no dog waiting at home, no tomatoes to water, no one who particularly needed me to be in my apartment in Phoenix, pretending I enjoyed apartment life. At Coyote Wells, the tasks were finite and visible. Water pressure either held or it did not. The automatic flush valves either behaved or they didn't. The fresh caulk at the expansion joints either cured correctly or failed under heat. A well-run place is consoling for that reason. It does not ask you who you were in a marriage or what exactly happened in the conversation where you realized the marriage was already over. It asks only whether the pump cycle sounds right. The first sign that something beyond the site was changing came in a form so ordinary I almost missed it. The rest area was not yet fully open, but after my 3rd day, we were instructed to unlock the westbound building and the vending breezeway during daylight hours, because the state had decided partial operation was better than a week of closure. That meant I began seeing travelers in small numbers, and that meant I began noticing the way traffic behaves when a region is uneasy. People reveal a lot at rest stops, not because they mean to, because travel loosens the edges of routine. You see what they throw away, what they buy when there are only 12 options, how quickly they leave the car, whether they let the dog sniff or tug it back, whether they stand under the shade for 30 seconds or 20 minutes. You learn the difference between vacation tired and evacuation tired without having a clean vocabulary for either. On the first public day, An older couple in a Class C motorhome spent nearly an hour at one of the picnic tables with a paper atlas open between them. That was unusual, only because hardly anybody carried paper atlases anymore. Around noon, two young men in a plumbing van used the sink, filled every bottle they had, and asked if there was a fuel station closer than 40 miles, because the line back in town had stretched around the block. I assumed a tanker delay. That happens. By late afternoon, 3 separate people asked me if I had heard anything about a temporary closure farther west, though each described a different town, and none seemed sure where they had heard it. On the second day, the trash changed. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but facilities work trains you to read waste streams. Vacation trash is cups, wrappers, orange peels, coffee stirrers, sunscreen packaging, paper towels, the occasional exploded diaper situation. What I began finding instead were travel sickness remains, empty electrolyte bottles, half-used fever reducers, disposable masks, latex gloves, several shirts with the sleeves torn off, as if they had been used for cold compresses or makeshift bandages. One motel towel someone had thrown away with great haste. More vomit in the sinks than the traffic volume justified. I called my supervisor, a patient man named Greg, who had spent 30 years in roadside maintenance and therefore mistrusted both panic and optimism. "Something's moving, people," I told him, "westbound especially." "Construction?" "Doesn't feel like construction." There was a pause. I could hear him shuffling papers, or maybe just making the sound older men make when they put the phone between shoulder and ear. "They're talking about some kind of aggressive flu in county facilities," he said. "Nothing official I've seen." "You want me to pull you off-site?" I looked through the office window at the nearly finished water panel, the racks of janitorial supplies, the shade canopies, the clean concrete. "No," I said, "not yet. I just wanted it logged." That became my habit over the next several days. Logging without dramatizing. The number of vehicles stopping went up and then down. Families began traveling in odd combinations, not with luggage neatly staged for a trip, but with loose household objects visible through windows. Laundry baskets, lampshades, a birdcage once, a microwave strapped into the back seat with a seatbelt. More people slept in their cars for an hour or two before continuing. Some seemed unsure whether to keep moving at all. One afternoon, a woman in hospital scrubs stood in the shade near the pet walk and stared west for so long I eventually stepped out and asked whether she needed water. She nodded, took the paper cup from me and said, "Have you noticed how everyone is either in a hurry or already too late?" It was such a clean sentence that I remember it word for word. Before I could ask what she meant, she thanked me, poured the rest of the water over the back of her neck, and drove off in a silver Corolla with a cracked taillight. The radio didn't help. AM was full of fragments, heat advisories, a brush fire report, then a long stretch of callers talking over one another about road closures, school schedules, emergency room waits, and a rumor that some counties were asking families to keep sick relatives home unless they were having trouble breathing. FM was calmer, almost conspicuously so. Music blocks ran longer than usual. Station voices sounded practiced in the way people do when they have been told to say less. By the 5th night, I started sleeping with the portable weather radio on low volume, not because it was useful, but because static and human voices gave shape to the hours. The 6th day was when my reasoning finally outran my hope. A westbound refrigerated truck stopped in the far lot just after dawn, badly enough parked that I knew the driver was beyond ordinary fatigue. He came inside, washed his face for a long time, bought 3 bottles of water and every salt-heavy snack in one of the vending machines, then stood looking at me as if he had meant to ask something, but had forgotten the words. "You okay to drive?" I asked. He smiled, but not at me. "Depends what counts." He had the gray, careful look of someone holding himself together through procedure. Truckers often do. He noticed the inspection clipboard in my hand and asked if I knew whether California was screening traffic. "I don't know," I said. He nodded as if I had confirmed something. Then he said, "They told us to keep moving. That's all anybody says. Keep moving." He made it back to his cab. He did not make it out of the lot. An hour later, I saw the truck still idling. The refrigeration unit was knocking in a bad rhythm. The driver sat upright behind the wheel with both hands in his lap, head tilted slightly, not moving at all. I walked halfway across the lot before I stopped myself. A facilities man is not a medic. Standing near a hot truck with an unknown sickness in the air is not bravery. It is confusion with good posture. I got on the site radio, then my cell, then the old emergency line in the office. No answer from anyone local. Greg texted back 20 minutes later. "Do not approach vehicle. County overwhelmed. Lock building if needed." I stood inside the service entrance and watched the truck until the engine coughed itself dead. Near sunset, the driver opened the cab door and climbed down. I want to be careful here, because this was the first moment I knew the problem was no longer one of rumor or public messaging or some bad seasonal wave that would make the news sound embarrassed for a week and then settle into statistics. People use the word zombie because it is efficient, and eventually I used it too, though never with much satisfaction. It makes the thing sound theatrical. What I saw was not theatrical. It was wrong in a bureaucratic way, like a form processed with the wrong assumptions all the way through. He stepped down from the cab, stood as though waiting for instructions, and then began walking toward the westbound lanes with no evident interest in the building, the shade, or the truck he had just left. His shirt was dark with sweat. One sleeve had dried blood at the cuff. He moved steadily, without the hesitations of an injured person or the simple aimlessness of someone disoriented. He just walked. When he reached the shoulder fence, he turned and began following it north, one hand trailing the chain link as if learning its shape. That was the first infected person I saw clearly enough to stop needing euphemisms. By then, the choice in front of me was not whether something serious was happening. The choice was where serious would be easier to survive. I drove it out in my head like a route estimate. My apartment in Phoenix was 6 hours away if the road behaved, which it plainly no longer did. There were towns in between, choke points at fuel stations, unknown closures, and the increasing possibility that any stop I made would leave me in closer contact with confused people than I could manage. Coyote Wells, on the other hand, had water, shade, distance, line of sight, a generator, a fenced service yard, 2 months' worth of janitorial chemicals I could ignore, a small solar array that kept the exterior lighting and office batteries alive, and enough vending stock to function as controlled calories if I supplemented carefully. It also had something most homes did not: space around it. In cities and suburbs, trouble stacks, sound reflects, people bunch. A single bad decision can put 10 more decisions within arm's reach. At Coyote Wells, anything approaching me had to cross open ground or come up a clearly visible ramp from the highway. There was no upstairs neighbor, no dark hallway, no lobby full of arguments. So I stayed. The decision did not feel heroic. It felt administrative, like circling the least bad option on a form. That evening I called Mateo. The call went through on the third try. "Are you with your mom?" I asked. "Yeah." "Stay there. Don't go anywhere unless she says." "Dad, what's happening?" I looked at the empty lot, the darkening sky, the refrigerated truck, cooling with little metal ticks. I did not want to lie to him, and I did not want to put my uncertainty inside his body, where it would have nowhere useful to go. "There's a lot of disruption on the highways," I said. "I'm in a safe place. I need you to stay inside and keep your phone charged." He was quiet for a second, then said, "Are you coming back?" "Not tonight." "Okay." He said it in the flat, cooperative tone children use when they understand more than they are willing to demonstrate. We stayed on the line another minute, speaking around practical details. Water, food, backup battery. Keep the curtains closed if there's commotion outside. Text. Don't call if the network gets crowded. Afterward, I sat at the office desk and wrote out the first version of what became my survival routine. Morning. Water test. Perimeter walk. Vehicle count. Radio scan. Food inventory. Midday. Shade maintenance. Restroom flush cycle. Battery check. Notes. Late afternoon. Secure exterior doors. Cover reflective surfaces. Boil water for night thermos. Review maps. Night. Lights limited to service side. No unnecessary noise. Hourly listen from office door until midnight. Then sleep in work clothes. Once I had the list, I felt better. Lists do not solve fear, but they give it boundaries. A list says, here is what matters first. Here is what can be done before thinking goes soft. The next 3 days settled into a shape. The public side of the rest area became less public. Traffic continued, but in thinning bursts rather than the normal distributed flow. Some vehicles stopped only long enough to use the restroom and fill bottles. Others sat for hours with shades up and doors closed. Once, just before noon, a family of 5 slept in an SUV parked crooked under the Ramada, every window covered with towels clipped by clothespins. I did not disturb them. By the time I came back from checking the chlorine feed, they were gone. I locked the eastbound building completely and concentrated utilities in the westbound side. 1 functioning restroom was simpler to manage than 2. I shut down the outdoor drinking fountains to reduce standing water. I wheeled the trash bins farther from the entrances so scavenging animals would not bang around near the doors at night. I taped cardboard over the lower halves of the vending machine fronts because I noticed the reflected light and snack colors were pulling the attention of infected wanderers from the far edge of the lot. They were not many. Desert exposure seemed to slow them. But not many is a category best managed before it becomes a count. On the 8th day, the power dropped twice in under an hour. The solar backup held the essentials, but I started the generator manually for the first time and listened until its tone settled. The generator sat in a cinder block enclosure behind the shed, with intake louvers that always collected more dust than seemed physically possible. I cleaned them, topped the diesel from the site reserve, and revised the routine again. The staff room grew more domestic in proportion to uncertainty. I moved the camp cot to the corner with the least direct afternoon heat. I set my food on one shelf and labeled another for trading/emergency, even though there was no one there to trade with yet. I began cooking rice on a small propane burner outside the service door at dusk, because the act of making one warm thing a day helped time behave. At night, I sat on the low concrete pad behind the building, where the desert opened westward, and watched the highway. The silence did not arrive all at once. It narrowed. First, the private cars thinned, until each set of headlights felt like a separate event. Then the freight traffic changed. Big rigs still moved, but with longer gaps and more signs of improvisation. Trailers improperly sealed, hand-lettered notes in windshields. Pairs of trucks traveling close as if convoy instinct had reawakened in men who would normally prefer independence. Then even that became irregular. The road itself started to look wider. On the 10th day, I used the site's low-power traveler information transmitter for the first time. It was an old system, one of those highway advisory AM setups that nobody remembered until weather or construction made them briefly useful. Coyote Wells had a small transmitter cabinet in the service shed, tied to a looping message channel that could be updated from a worn terminal program older than some of the state interns. Usually it broadcast things like road conditions ahead, or truck parking limited next 40 miles. The signal was weak and local, only meant for approaching vehicles. I spent 20 minutes deciding whether using it was responsible. Not because I doubted its function, because words are infrastructure too, and bad instructions can do structural damage to strangers. In the end, I recorded a message so plain it nearly embarrassed me. Westbound travelers, Coyote Wells rest area has potable water and limited restroom access, no fuel, no medical services. Stay in daylight if possible. Use caution near parked vehicles. Repeat, water available, no fuel, no medical services. I listened to my own voice on the test receiver and heard how calm I sounded. Not reassuring, not frightened, just specific. That became another part of the routine. Morning and late afternoon, I updated the message if conditions changed. When I later ran into people who had stopped because of it, they told me the same thing. They trusted it because it didn't promise anything. There is a kind of comfort in modest honesty. By the 11th day, the infected were easier to interpret. I hesitate to say I understood them. That gives too much dignity to pattern recognition under pressure. But I learned what mattered near the site. They were drawn less to light itself than to movement associated with occupancy. Doors, voices, engines entering the lot, sudden changes in shade where a person stepped from one brightness to another. In full sun, many simply stalled under whatever shelter they could find, standing beside concrete walls or low shrubs in postures that would once have suggested exhaustion. After dark, they moved more freely, especially if the air cooled quickly. They also retained a kind of route memory. More than once, I saw an infected person follow the painted pedestrian path from parking area to restroom door with a terrible, lingering fidelity to ordinary use. That affected me more than I expected. Not fear, exactly. Something sadder. A body remembering where relief used to be. Because of that, I left one exterior sink in service near the far corner of the building, away from the main doors, so that desperate or confused travelers could rinse off without bunching at the entrance. I do not know whether that counted as kindness or simply traffic management. In a long emergency, the difference narrows. On the 12th day, I got my first companion. She arrived not as a dramatic interruption, but as a problem of tires. I heard the vehicle before I saw it, a small engine laboring unevenly on the ramp. A white county fleet pickup rolled into the lot with one rear tire nearly flat and stopped beneath the nearest shade structure. The driver remained inside for a full minute with both hands on the wheel. Then a woman in a tan work shirt stepped out, took one look at the empty highway, and laughed once under her breath in the way people do when the evidence finally aligns with what they already suspected. I stayed by the service door and called out, "You sick?" "Not that kind," she said. Her name was Marisol Vega. She worked for a county mapping office, though in practice that meant she did a little of everything related to roads, drainage, flood markers, utility easements, and the kind of local records that become valuable precisely when centralized systems begin losing confidence. She had been trying to verify washout reports and improvised closures on secondary routes after losing contact with 2 field crews. A blown tire and a bad spare had turned Coyote Wells from one more waypoint into a stop. She saw my hesitation and nodded toward the shed. "If you've got a jack and a compressor, I can do the rest." That suited me fine. We handled the interaction like professionals before we handled it like survivors. Distance first, water second, tire third. She wore gloves. I set out tools. We spoke from opposite sides of the truck bed until mutual usefulness had established a kind of trust. After the tire was changed, she asked the question I had been waiting for. "Are you staying here on purpose?" "Yes." "Is it working?" I looked around. At the Ramadas, the locked eastbound building, the sun on the highway, the neatly stacked cases of toilet tissue in the service room, the handwritten ration list taped above my desk, the advisory radio terminal still glowing green. "So far," I said. She asked if she could stay one night. I told her yes before I could talk myself into making it complicated. This was not, importantly, a question of opening my refuge or preserving my refuge. Coyote Wells was not a bunker, and I was not a gatekeeper of anything scarce enough to justify that kind of self-importance. A rest area works because it is built for passage. What I had was not exclusivity. What I had was enough structure to make another night survivable for someone with a working mind and a county truck. Marisol took the bench seat of her pickup for sleeping and insisted on earning space by being useful. By dusk, she had built a hand-drawn map board from a sheet of packaging cardboard and a black marker, labeling known passable routes, uncertain closures, water points, and places to avoid based on her last confirmed contacts. I had water and building systems. She had geography and handwriting people could read from 10 feet away. It made the place feel less like an accident and more like a node. That night, for the first time since I'd stayed on purpose, I ate with another person. Rice, canned beans, and a packet of hot sauce she found in her glove box. We sat on separate folding chairs behind the service wall and watched the light go out of the sky. "Do you know what I miss already?" she said. "What?" "Incidental traffic." I laughed. "You're the first person I've met who misses traffic." "No, I miss what it means. People going somewhere for reasons that aren't all the same." That stayed with me. The next morning was the 15th, the morning of the silence. Marisol was still asleep in the truck when I stepped outside with my coffee and heard the highway not happening. When I woke her, she sat up immediately, turned her head like an animal listening, and said, "That's bad." "It is." Or everyone finally made the same decision. We spent the next hour doing what calm people do when they do not yet know whether they are in danger or merely in a new category. We checked the advisory frequency. Dead, except for our own message. We scanned FM, AM, and weather. Fragmentary. On the county band, she caught a clipped voice mention a closure line being overtaken west of Dateland. Then nothing. I walked the perimeter with binoculars from the lost and found cabinet. Cheap ones a tourist had never reclaimed months earlier. No vehicle movement to the horizon either direction. And still, the site itself functioned. Water pressure held. Generator fuel remained adequate. Solar batteries were charging. The cooler in the office kept ice packs half frozen. The vending machines, wonderfully indifferent, continued to offer peanuts, crackers, cookies, and terrible coffee concentrated exactly the moment money had become ceremonial. By late morning, we saw the reason for some of the silence. A loose line of vehicles appeared eastbound from the west, not traveling at speed but rolling, coasting, stalling, and in 3 cases simply resting at angles that told their own story. None came into the lot. They had either run out of fuel or lost the capacity to choose. Between them and the access ramp walked perhaps 24 infected, dispersed widely across the shoulder and median, all moving east. Not rushing, not hunting in the dramatic sense people like to imagine, just continuing, as if some degraded momentum in them, still believed the highway was for transit. Marisol stood beside me with the binoculars pressed to her face. They're following the road. Or the road is the easiest ground. Maybe both. We lowered the advisory sign arm at the lot entrance that afternoon and shifted the broadcast message. Not closed exactly. More selective. Coyote Wells Rest Area remains operational for essential stop only. Daylight use recommended. Avoid stopping if large groups are visible. Water available at West Building. Move quietly. Repeat. Water available. Move quietly. That phrase, move quietly, turned out to matter. The first people to arrive after the silence were two brothers in a landscaping truck. With a trailer full of mowers, they had no reason to be towing anymore. They had been driving mostly at dawn and dusk, pulling off whenever they saw clusters on the roadway. The younger brother had a bite on his forearm, bandaged and not discussed, until I noticed the way the older one kept placing himself between his brother and any enclosed space. There are moments when compassion and accuracy want different things from you. I gave them water, a tire plug kit, 2 paper maps, and the plainest instructions I had. Shade for an hour, then move while you still can. They thanked me with painful politeness and left before sunset. A day later, a retired school bus mechanic named Leon arrived in a church van carrying medical supplies that had long ago stopped matching the labels on their boxes. He knew generators better than I did and stayed 3 days, during which he and I rigged a quieter exhaust extension with salvage ducting so we could run the generator at night in shorter, less noticeable intervals. Before he left, he repaired a temperamental breaker I had been babying with superstition. That was how the rest stop changed from my job site into something else. Not a fortress, not a camp, a maintained interruption in a stretch of bad road. People came in 2s and 3s, rarely staying more than 1 night unless a vehicle forced the issue. Some were families, some lone drivers, some county workers, some simply people who had kept moving because every place behind them had become less legible than the road ahead. Marisol turned her map board into a daily bulletin with headings: water, passable routes, known fuel, avoid, radio hours. I handled sanitation, water treatment, perimeter checks, and sleeping arrangements when sleeping arrangements were necessary, which usually meant benches, truck cabs, or the shaded concrete beside someone's own car. Our rules were few and deliberately boring. No engines idling longer than needed. No shouting across the lot. Use daylight. Refill water. Don't hoard what you can't carry. If someone is sick in a way we all understand, keep them outside and separate. If you leave information, leave it dated. Those rules did more for calm than weapons would have. People enter panic when the environment feels arbitrary. A few consistent procedures let them borrow steadiness they haven't generated themselves. There were hard moments, of course, but even those arrived in the flattened way crisis tends to become logistical over time. One evening, just before dark, an RV came in fast, hit the curb, and stalled across 2 spaces. The couple inside were beyond ordinary exhaustion. The woman had been driving for 30 hours in pieces. Her husband had developed symptoms 2 days earlier and spent most of that time belted into the passenger seat because she could not bear to stop and could not bear to look directly at what was changing. Marisol took the woman to the far shade with water and a towel. I stood with the husband from outside the open RV door and told him as honestly as I could that he should not continue with them. He looked at the dashboard, not at me, and said, "I kept thinking if we crossed one more state line it would become explainable." There was nothing I could add to that. We helped the woman unload what she truly needed. Then she drove east alone at sunrise after sleeping 4 hours on a picnic table bench with her shoes still on. We never learned their last name. I wrote Silver Winnebago. One departed eastbound. 0620 in the log, and closed the book. The days developed texture. Morning was inspection. Midday was heat management. Late afternoon belonged to maps, conversation, and small repairs. Night brought listening. Because the highway had gone silent in the large sense, smaller sounds became important. The click of cooling engines told us who intended to stay. Gravel crunch on the access ramp separated trucks from sedans before headlights came into view. The infected, when they passed near enough to matter, made almost no cinematic noise at all. A shoe drag, a hand on fence wire. Once, very late, the soft repetitive tap of someone nudging a closed restroom door with the patience of old habit. That sound bothered me for weeks. There is a temptation in stories like this to imagine survival as a series of decisive episodes. But what I remember most clearly are the routines that made decisiveness less necessary. I remember brushing dust from the solar controller screens every morning before the heat rose. I remember the way bottled water tasted slightly of warm plastic by noon, unless we rotated it through the cooler. I remember Marisol dating each update in thick block letters and underlining old information expires fast until it became almost a prayer. I remember using a grease pencil on the office window to track chlorine residuals and vehicle departures because paper blew away whenever someone opened the wrong door. I remember a boy of maybe 8 sitting cross-legged under a Ramada, eating vending machine crackers one square at a time while his grandmother slept in the back seat, and the care with which he folded the wrapper when he was done, as if littering might be the final insult. When there were enough people on site to justify roles, the roles emerged naturally. I did water, sanitation, structure, and the advisory transmitter. Marisol handled route intelligence, record-keeping, and conversation that required a human face rather than a facility's face. Leon, during his brief stay, made energy and mechanical noise his territory. Later, a veterinary technician named Nisha spent 2 nights with us and reorganized our first aid cabinet into something rational, while also teaching a tired father how to cool a dog safely in desert heat. No one voted. Useful people simply moved toward the thing they can stabilize. The system evolved because the road kept teaching us. We learned to position arriving vehicles in alternating spaces rather than clusters so that quick departures remained possible. We designated one shade Ramada for short rests only, and another for overnight sleeping, which reduced confusion without making anyone feel processed. We began leaving a narrow strip of blue painter's tape on the ground to show the quietest path from parking area to water spigot, simply because people follow marks when they are tired. We stopped letting anyone use the public trash cans near the entrance after sunset because lids slamming echoed farther than seemed reasonable in the dry air. I modified the advisory broadcast twice a day, always keeping it short enough to be heard in a passing car. Water and restroom available westbound side, no fuel, use daylight, limited stop only. Then later, quiet side, water available, move steadily east if possible, check bulletin board. Eventually I added one line I had resisted because it felt too close to official authority. Do not rely on further services ahead. The first time I said it into the microphone, I realized how much of my life had been spent assuming continuity. Not perfection, not fairness, just continuity. One more gas station, one more clinic, one more lit sign at the next exit. Part of what ended out there was not only movement, but expectation. And yet, strangely, I did not feel the world had become unreal. It became smaller. That was different. At a working rest stop before all this, people passed through in narratives too large for me to see. Honeymoons, funerals, custody exchanges, sales trips, college drop-offs, family vacations gone mildly wrong, exhausted truck runs, retirees in clean white sneakers taking the dog out at sunset. During the outbreak, those huge invisible narratives collapsed into more immediate scales. This gallon of water, this tire pressure, this map, this hour of shade, this safe departure window before the road heated, and the visible clusters on the median began to drift. In that smaller scale, I found, unexpectedly, a kind of peace. Not happiness. The distinction matters. Happiness would have been obscene. But peace in knowing what the next useful act was. I did not have to solve the outbreak. I did not have to interpret national failures, or forgive public messaging, or imagine the whole continent at once. I had to keep the chlorination feed balanced, keep the generator running quietly, keep the westbound restroom from turning into a disease reservoir, and tell travelers the truth in sentences that fit on a local radio loop. Civilization, I began to think, might be nothing more than maintained intervals of predictability. A week after the silence, that idea was tested. Just after noon, when heat had driven everyone remaining on site into the densest available shade, we heard 3 quick horn blasts from the east ramp, not frantic, intentional. A utility convoy came in, 2 county water trucks, a state DOT pickup, and a battered ambulance with no lights on. They parked in a loose square, and for the first time in days, I saw the look of people arriving at a place they had been told might exist, but did not quite believe in, until the water spigot and shaded concrete became visible through the windshield. The DOT man who stepped out was sunburned to the edge of fever, and wearing an orange vest filthy enough to count as camouflage. He introduced himself as Kellen, and asked who was operating the site. "I am," I said, then added, "and Marisol." He looked from me to the bulletin board to the clean entrance path to the lined-up water containers near the west wall. "Well," he said quietly, "you've saved us some work." They had been trying to establish a controlled daylight corridor eastbound, using utility crews, county maps, and whatever radio fragments still passed between jurisdictions. Fuel was scarce. Medical capacity was nearly theoretical. But there was a plan forming, if plan can include the words "best available route" written by hand on the hood of a truck. Coyote Wells sat at exactly the right interval to become an official way station. That changed my role again. Until then, I had been operating on practical legitimacy. I was there. The systems were mine to understand, and usefulness had created permission. With the convoy's arrival, the rest stop re-entered a larger network. Not the old one. A thinner, more local, more honest version of it. Crews installed a temporary water bladder to supplement the cistern. We set up a check-in table using a folding picnic surface. Marisol's map board became the template for a proper route board with erasable panels. The ambulance team claimed the Far Ramada for assessment and cooling, though they were frank about their limitations. Kellen and I walked the service yard, and for the first time in weeks, I explained the generator and electrical panel to someone who could officially inherit them. I expected relief and felt something more complicated. For so many days, Coyote Wells had belonged to the scale of hands-on knowledge. I knew which exterior latch stuck in afternoon heat. I knew how long the west sink took to run cool. I knew which vending machine spirals would misfeed the peanut crackers unless you nudged the glass. Bringing it back into a public chain of command felt necessary and, for a moment, intimate in the wrong way, like strangers rearranging a room where you had been sleeping. Marisol saw it on my face before I said anything. "You can hand things over without losing them," she said. "I know." "No, you know that as a sentence. I'm telling you it's true." She was right, of course. The point of maintaining a pause is not to own the pause forever. It is to keep it available. So I spent the next 2 days doing what I do best: documentation. I wrote out water procedures in block letters and taped them inside the service cabinet. I marked fuel consumption on the generator housing with a paint pen. I labeled which breakers could be left off during low occupancy hours. I drew arrows for gray water routing and left notes about the habit the western restroom door had of bouncing back open if you didn't pull it firmly after dusk. I showed 2 county workers how to cycle the advisory transmitter and which message length read most clearly on the dashboard receiver. By then, the highway was not silent anymore. It was not normal either. Normal is dense and forgettable. What returned was sparse movement with intention. Utility trucks, a produce hauler escorted by 2 pickups, a school district bus carrying families east under county guidance, private cars in careful intervals, each one visibly loaded with too much life. The sound came back in pieces, the distant murmur first, then individual engines. Then for one long afternoon, a steady enough rhythm that I found myself no longer listening for it with effort. The first time I heard a tractor-trailer downshift on the approach grade and felt the familiar vibration in the concrete beneath my boots, I had to stop what I was doing and stand still for a second. It is difficult to explain why that almost made me cry. Maybe because roads are promises more than structures, and hearing one function again, even in reduced form, meant some promise had survived. On my final evening at Coyote Wells, the sky went lavender over the flats, and the air held a little of the day's heat without pressing it at you. Marisol had decided to continue east with the county mapping crew in the morning. Kellen had asked whether I would stay on another week to stabilize operations, and I had surprised myself by saying no. Not because I was tired of the place, because the place no longer required the specific, private version of me that had formed there. There is a moment in any long emergency when usefulness changes shape. If you miss that moment, you start serving your own attachment rather than the work. So I walked the perimeter one last time. The parking loops were no longer empty. 3 service vehicles, a family sedan, a livestock trailer refitted to carry water barrels, and 2 county pickups sat under the ramadas in deliberate order. The westbound building smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm concrete. The bulletin board carried updated routes in Kellen's rougher handwriting beneath Marisol's careful lettering. The advisory transmitter played my voice one final night, because nobody had bothered changing the recording yet. Water available. Daylight travel recommended. Check route board. I stood by the edge of the lot where, on the 15th morning, I had heard nothing on the road at all. Now there was sound again. Not enough to disappear into, enough to measure time by. Marisol came over with 2 paper cups of instant coffee from the service kettle and handed me one. You know, she said, if you told me 2 weeks ago I was going to miss a rest stop when I left it, I would have assumed the heat got me. It probably did. She smiled and leaned against the low wall beside me. Out on the interstate, a small convoy of headlights moved east in even spacing, too far away for make or color, just points of intention crossing the dusk. What do you think happens to places like this? She asked. Rest stops? No, in between places, after people start depending on them. I took a sip of coffee that tasted like cardboard and metal and comfort. I think, I said slowly, most of the time they disappear back into the larger thing. That's probably healthy. And this time? I looked at the lit vending breezeway, the map board, the water spigot with its neat line of filled containers, the highway carrying careful movement through gathering dark. This time, maybe people remember what made them useful. She nodded as if that was enough. The next morning I packed in less than 20 minutes. When a place has stripped your life down to essentials, departure is efficient. I folded the camp cot, cleaned the staff room counter, took down the spare socks from the cabinet latch, and left behind the kettle, because somehow it had become site property in my mind. I put my personal notebooks in my duffel, but left the operational logs on the desk for Kellen. At the last moment, I added one page to the top of the stack. If traffic sound disappears again, assume system change before assuming equipment failure. Listen first. It was half joke, half instruction, entirely sincere. Kellen shook my hand by the service gate and thanked me in the concise way competent people do when gratitude and scheduling are competing for space. Marisol climbed into the county truck, 2 vehicles behind mine, and tapped her horn once. I got in the maintenance pickup I'd been using for side errands, checked mirrors, and pulled slowly onto the access road. As I reached the ramp, I looked back. From the highway, Coyote Wells appeared exactly as a rest area should, a clean interruption in a large, dry distance. Shade, water, order, nothing dramatic about it. Nothing announcing what it had been for those 14 nights and the long days after. That felt right to me. The best infrastructure is almost anonymous. I merged eastbound into a lane occupied now by enough vehicles to require attention, but not enough to feel crowded. 55 miles an hour at first, then a little faster where the road opened. To my right, the desert rolled out in pale tans and muted green, every wash and ridge sharply drawn by morning light. To my left, the westbound side still looked emptier than I wanted it to, though not deserted. A water truck passed going the other way. Then a flatbed with fencing material. Then, after a long stretch, a family minivan with blankets taped over part of the rear windows and a child-stuffed giraffe visible between 2 coolers. Normal had not returned. I do not know if it ever does in the exact form people mean when they say the word, but movement had. I drove for nearly an hour before I turned off the radio and realized I no longer needed it to tell me whether the road was alive. I could hear it through the cab, steady under the tires. That broad, low hush I had once slept to without appreciating. Not loud, just continuous. For the first time in weeks, I let my shoulders drop. I thought about Mateo, about getting within range where I might have a clean enough signal to call. I thought about my apartment, probably stale and dim, and full of the minor comforts I had once regarded as insufficient. I thought about how strange it was that I had learned, at a desert rest stop, that I preferred usefulness to certainty. Mostly, though, I thought about pauses. How much of a life depends on them. How a person can survive long distances, not because the road is kind, but because, at intervals, someone made a place where stopping does not equal failing. A faucet, a bench, shade, a bulletin board dated in clear handwriting, a voice on a weak AM signal refusing to promise more than water, and one honest direction. By late morning the sun was high and the interstate shimmer had begun, turning distance into a wavering silver field. In the old days that shimmer had made the road seem endless. Now it made it seem shared. Somewhere behind me, Coyote Wells was already filling again with people who would use it for 20 minutes or 2 hours and then continue on. Some would never know how close the place had come to becoming just another dry concrete shell beside a dead road. That was fine. Public things do not need witnesses to justify themselves. Around noon I passed a sign crew setting up portable boards for a future closure point, and one of the boards, still dark, reflected my truck for a second, before the angle changed, and I was gone from it. There is a version of this story that would end with a grand conclusion about society, or preparedness, or the hidden competencies of ordinary people. I understand the appeal of that, but the truth is softer, and to me, more useful. The world narrowed. Then it reorganized around whatever still worked. For a while, I was one of the things that still worked. That is all. It was enough.